My name is Chuan Fu. I'm the Director of Special International Projects at Duke Law School. Today it's my great honor to introduce our guest speaker, Professor Jeremy Cohen from NYU School of Law. Needless to say, Professor Cohen is an internationally renowned expert on China legal system in China law as well as East Asian law. But to me, Professor Cohen is a long-term colleague and advisor. In the late 1990s, I worked with Professor Cohen in the Beijing and Hong Kong offices of Paul Weiss, where Professor Cohen was a senior partner and in charge of the firm's China law practice. And from 2000 to 2001, I studied, when I was pursuing my LLM degree in New York, I studied with Professor Cohen at New York University. So I'm so thrilled today to see him coming and share his expertise and perspectives on China legal system. Professor Cohen, and I'm sure his discussion is going to ignite very heated discussion here today. He's very famous in this area, so I don't really think that I need to say about his bio, but I'm just gonna give you some highlights from his bio. Professor Cohen earned his JD from Yale Law School in 1955 and began his academic career at University of California School of Law at Berkeley in 1959. From 1964 to 1979, Professor Cohen served as Associate Dean and Director of East Asian Legal Studies at Harvard Law School and helped pioneer the introduction of East Asian legal systems and perspectives into American legal curricula. Professor Cohen is currently Professor of Law at NYU Law School, off counsel of Paul Weiss, New York office. He's a senior fellow for Asia Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's a director of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and the list goes on and on and on. And Professor Cohen speaks regularly at high-profile events on China legal system and U.S.-China relations. So now let's welcome Professor Cohen.
Well, thanks. Thanks, Hu Chun. I hope my obituary is as kind. I've discovered many things since coming to Duke yesterday, and the most surprising I just discovered as I walked in here is that Miss Hu, whom I have known, as she indicated in other incarnations, was working here in a good cause, helping with the graduate program. I used to run the graduate programs at Harvard Law School for many years, and I said to a few of you before that I don't think anything was more fun, and my major academic innovation as chairman of the Harvard graduate program was the institution of frequent dances, because I thought they needed more sociability, and it happened to be something that has worked. I'm really happy to come here for various reasons. I just walked into the dean's office and I spotted this. Maybe you all haven't seen this, but this is what we call 巧合, coincidence. Very attractive magazine about Duke Law School in China. So if you haven't seen it, get a copy. I had breakfast with former Dean Carrington, who has made a major contribution to education of Chinese at Duke and in China. And he gave me this book, fairly recent, Spreading America's Word, Stories of Its Lawyer Missionaries. I'm sort of a missionary in wolf's clothing, and he stopped in 1976, so I just got the book. I haven't even looked in the index to see whether I'm mentioned. That's usually the first thing academics who have very strong egos do. But this is too new for me to do that. I was here 20 years ago for a conference on Chinese civil law, which was then very new. And I met several of the recent Duke graduates from China, including the legendary Gao Shiqing, who returns here occasionally for lightning-like teaching stints. And I was very impressed with Duke's far-sighted support for Chinese legal education. Now, I thought I'd try to talk about what's going on in China, give you a sense of the relevance of law, where I see it as fitting in. This is an enormously controversial subject, and it's one on which huge importance hangs. China's leaders are always emphasizing harmony, stability. I used to hear that a lot in South Korea and Taiwan in the late 60s and 70s, when the dictatorial regimes there all said they want harmony. We can't afford human rights, we can't afford legal protections, because that might shatter harmony. So oppression was their route to harmony. Now China's new leaders are confronting a crisis. They have to figure out, heaven is wonderful, we say. The problem is, how do you get there? How do you get harmony in a society that's changing as rapidly as China? Probably no society in human history has ever made as much progress as China in the last 25 years. But it's becoming a victim of its own success. Social economic change is so huge. It's creating such problems every day, especially for those who feel they're being left behind, not only in the countryside where the majority of people still live, but even in the city. There are many urban dwellers who are not part of the new success. So the question is, what has law got to do with it? I should confess to you my point of view before telling you what I think. I have been mostly an academic in life, first at Berkeley, then Harvard, and NYU. But for 21 years, I was a lawyer representing mostly foreign interests in China. From 1978, when the third plenum of the 11th Central Committee embarked upon this exciting course after the Cultural Revolution, Deng Xiaoping persuaded his colleagues that the new leadership would emphasize law as part of China's desire to modernize. I have been a witness. I lived in China for 2.5 years, beginning January '79. It was the most exciting period. At the same time, I have occasionally taken part during that period in criminal cases. Sometimes business people get locked up, especially in China. It's fairly easy to do. So I had some experience along those lines, and since 2001, I have withdrawn gradually from the international business negotiations process. I spent a lot of time negotiating contracts and negotiating disputes arising under contracts. Roughly speaking, the 80s were devoted to making contracts and the 90s to breaking contracts. So dispute resolution and the courts began to come into view in a way that in 1980 they did not. There's a lot of seats here. So in any event, at the same time, I started to take part in arbitration. First as an advocate, 代理人, and later when China began to permit foreigners to serve as arbitrators, I began to be an arbitrator. So I have that somewhat jaded perspective. But since 1999, I have frequently taken part in criminal cases in China. Now, those from China immediately must raise an intellectual eyebrow and say, how? He's not a Chinese citizen. He's not allowed to practice law in China. We are, as foreigners, allowed to take part in arbitrations, but not in court proceedings. So whenever I'm asked to help somebody who's unfortunate enough to get locked up in China, the first thing I have to do after talking with them, if they agree, is to get them a Chinese lawyer. And I have enjoyed the cooperation of many criminal defense lawyers in China who, some of them are admirable, extremely able and quite courageous people. being a criminal defense lawyer in China, as I wrote a few years ago in the Hong Kong Law Journal, can lead to high income. It can, but it can also lead to high risk, and does. So I just want to give you some sense of my own participation, and obviously I also take part frequently in teaching in China and in law reform exercises in China, trying to help court reform, criminal justice reform, civil administrative law. There's lots to do. And many foreigners, surely not just myself, many foreigners are playing an active role. And the wonderful thing is Chinese authorities and Chinese academic institutions, law reform, people welcome our cooperation. This is not a case of the old missionary spirit trying to bring the heathen to Christ and foisting a new idea on them. This is something Chinese leaders had made a decision since 1978, and they have kept to it. It used to be until 78 that every 7 years or so, the pendulum would swing very broadly in China. And we have been through a number of periods, so that in 1978-79, many Chinese, while supporting the new emphasis on law to try to make China a safer, more humane, more efficient, prosperous place, they didn't believe it would last. They knew power would never be as absolute as it was under Chairman Mao, or even under Deng Xiaoping. But they weren't sure, was law here to stay? And when I decided I wanted to live in China for a couple of years, not just be a visitor, I found no national government agency was willing to invite me for a semester or a year. They all welcomed a quick lecture because that's safe, but who knows what tomorrow will bring. And to be tarred with the brush of working with I was then a Harvard law teacher, might prove to be detrimental to one's career advancement, depending on how things went. Fortunately, through a Chinese tutor of mine at Harvard, I met a man named Xiao Yang, not the man who's head of the Supreme Court now, but this man became governor of Sichuan, party secretary of Chongqing. He was then head of the Beijing Jingwei, the Beijing Economic Development Corporation. And he invited me, using the greater flexibility that a city often has to do things that the central government might find too bureaucratically risky to manage. So I had the chance to teach and work there and set up the first American or foreign or even Chinese law office, because in August '79, Chinese lawyers had not been rehabilitated. I was the first foreign lawyer in Beijing at that point. You had a few people at the CCPIT legal department, but they weren't real lawyers, but they learned, like Mr. Ren Zhenxing, who became head of the Supreme Court and head of the Central Political Legal Committee. But at that point, Chinese had not yet been given the permission to act as lawyers. That only came late in 1980. So I am a committed participant in history. I am not a withdrawn, objective academic. So when I give you my opinions, please discount for maybe imperception due to bias or other factors. Now, as we start to talk about China, we have to remember where we are. We are in America. And it used to be, before the internet, and certainly before the Bush administration, that one problem in going around China like a huckster trying to sell the rule of law, faithful to the tradition of the missionaries, was too often people could say, you know, you guys are so different. You don't have our problems. You're trying to foist on us a rule of law system that just doesn't suit China. Well, if they'd known more about America even then, they would have known it was a case perhaps of our saying, do as I say, not as I do, because we've had many imperfections in the American legal system. The worst kind of comparative law is to compare apples and oranges, to compare our theory with the other country's practice, because we know their reality. But I used to be a federal prosecutor before I discovered China, and I know something about the realities of criminal justice in the United States. That's why I first chose to study criminal justice in China. I felt you better start where you know something so you have comparative basis. So I think we have to look at reality in ourselves as well as elsewhere. And of course, since 9/11, it's been very, very prominent. We've had all kinds of problems with the detention of suspects, sometimes not even saying where the 11 or 1,200 people we first locked up after 9/11 were being kept, not even identifying them by name, often denying them immediate access to lawyers, not using the criminal justice system in order to facilitate their long-run detention, a technique well known to the Chinese police, as we'll discuss later. But if you call somebody an immigration law violator, you can lock them up, and you don't have to worry about the limits of the criminal procedure system in our country. And better yet, call them a material witness, and then you lock them up. And you don't worry about how long they're there, maybe. It's just a pretext for avoiding the criminal process. My colleague at NYU, Stephen Schulhofer, and others have done a very good job at tracking some of these things. And of course, since the invasion of Iraq and problems in Afghanistan, we're treated to accounts of torture, other unattractive interrogation techniques, and questions of whether certain people, even a few US citizens, have access to judicial review in our own courts. Our own constitutional system is being challenged at the very basis of the separation of powers by the discovery that President Bush has been tapping our telephones, etc., not using the FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act that was set up to regulate that kind of tapping. A blatant violation of the Constitution that I hope the courts, following the Youngstown Steel approach of Justice Jackson, will vindicate. I'm not going into this, you didn't come to hear that, but we mustn't forget that. Otherwise, it's so easy to become self-righteous, holier than thou person. So, back to China. Well, maybe the first point I should make is China's remarkable post-1978 efforts to create a legal system. You know, if you looked around China in 1978 and you were looking for the indicia of a legal system, you couldn't find much to go on. If you were looking for legislation about most things about legal institutions, and laws, and most regulatory material, very hard to find anything significant relating to law. Almost impossible to find any multilateral adherence by China to legal institutions like the UN Convention of '58 on the recognition and enforcement of foreign arbitral awards, or the various intellectual property conventions, or bilateral agreements. There were virtually no bilateral agreements like the mutual protection of investment agreements China has subsequently signed with so many countries, but not the United States yet, or even Canada. Tax treaties didn't exist. If you looked beyond the area of legal norms to legal institutions, in 1978 you saw shattered institutions. The courts were a shambles. The procuracy had been on the shelf for years. The prosecutor's system, the legal profession, as I mentioned earlier, had been abolished during the anti-rightist movement, 反右派运动, of 1957-58. Hard to find. Arbitration existed under the Soviet-style Foreign Trade Arbitration Commission that China had established in '54, but it was pretty dead. Not much going on. Of course, the whole trade pattern with the Soviet Union had been disrupted by the Sino-Soviet dispute, etc. Hard to find much in the way of legal institutions, procedures, personnel. Beginning 78, a lot of people who'd been out of action for 20 years were suddenly resurrected. And people who had been criminal court judges in 1956, 57 were told, now you're going to be one of our experts on foreign investment law and negotiating contracts. Sometimes electrical engineers were put in charge of approving foreign investment contracts and before they were even sent to law school at Duke and Columbia and Harvard and NYU and a lot of other places. Not much in the way of personnel because China didn't have a legal education system flourishing at that time. When I first visited China in '72, I told my hosts, what were they, the KUSH, yeah, the Science and Technology Organization, I said I want to go out to Beida, Peking University, and meet the legal people. Well, I went out there, but there were no legal people to meet. They were all still down on the farm having their heads reshaped by thought reform. And the next year, I went back again. I'm an optimist, you see, so I keep trying. You have to be if you're going to work in this field. I went back and I met a couple of law professors in '73. But I noticed they were distinguishable from American law professors in two basic respects. One is they looked a lot healthier. They had deep suntans. They'd been working in the fields for years, many of them. And the other was more troublesome. They talked a lot less. You already know how much American law teachers like to talk, and I'm Exhibit A. But these guys didn't talk because A, they had nothing to say, there was nothing to discuss at that point, at least that they could be allowed to talk about legally, and B, they were afraid. They didn't know. They were gun shy. Some of these people had been targets of the anti-rightist movement. More of them had been targets of the Cultural Revolution, and it wasn't much of a meeting. So that was the situation essentially in 1978, '79 on legal education. And if you were looking for legal scholarship to guide the new institutions, the new personnel, etc., forget it. If you walked into the Xinhua bookstore and you asked for books on law, they looked at you like you had Jing Sheng Bing, mental illness. There were no shelves on law, no books on law, nothing. Well, that was the situation. Now you look at the situation in China after more than a quarter of a century, and you see many of the formal indicia of a legal system. Huge number of norms. I don't think any regime has ever enacted more laws, more regulations, local, provincial, as well as national, than this group since 1979. It's impressive just as a product. Now, of course, you can criticize it. We can all poke holes in American statutes as well as Chinese statutes, and legislative draftsmanship was not exactly a high art in 1979, although they had a small elite group, many of whom had good legal education, some knowing foreign languages, especially English, who worked very hard to produce this stuff. China began to adhere to international agreements, multilateral agreements, and that's been a very prominent facet. Now, when you do a deal with China, the first thing you want to check out is what are the relevant international agreements that may affect your transaction. Oh, that's very nice of you. Thank you very much. The institutions. China has rebuilt the court system, the procurator system, broadened and strengthened. He's a very polite person. Broadened and strengthened its arbitration system, tried to encourage mediation organizations, alternative dispute resolution, and created a legal profession of perhaps as many as 140,000. Maybe you've got close to 200,000 judges. Maybe you have 160,000 prosecutors. You have now a huge number of law schools, over 400 law schools in China, a huge number of law graduates. Hundreds of thousands of people now take the bar exam required for judges, prosecutors, and lawyers. And they now have begun to take the same exam, at least in the first round. Legal scholarship has boomed. It's become a growth industry. And unlike previous legal scholarship in China, which used to just everybody took in everybody else's laundry, everybody repeated what Article 231 of the statute said, very uninteresting, very unanalytical, very uncourageous. But legal scholarship in China has matured. And you get a lot of books that are good. They're interesting. Some are even controversial. And we're beginning to get debates between foreign scholars and some of the great scholars in China, like the dean of Peking University Law School, Zhu Li. Monday, I'm going to a lunch seminar we're having at NYU where we're talking about Zhu Li's book about sending law to the countryside, raising the questions of what kind of a legal system does China's countryside need? How different from China's urban areas? Do you really need a graduate of Duke Law School to go back and be a judge in the countryside in China? Or is it better to have a retired member of the People's Liberation Army who grew up in the countryside, knows a little bit about law, but a lot about life? This is essentially the debate, see, and you can see a lot of these questions aren't simple. So you look around at what they've accomplished and the whole structure of law, the spur to improve law. Essentially it's come, I would say, from 4 waves. The first wave was the 20 years of lawlessness. In 1968, the People's Daily editorial was titled, "In Praise of Lawlessness." And that was, you know, when during the Cultural Revolution, Jiang Qing and others, Chairman Mao's wife, said, "All is chaos under heaven. The situation is excellent." Well, that's not exactly an environment for the flourishing of law. On the other hand, every dictator knows you really do need a legal system, if only to impose your authoritarian will. Lenin knew that. 1921, after a period of Bolshevik revolution, Lenin, who had gone to law school and even tried a few cases in the Tsarist courts, Lenin said, we have to have a legal system. One reason was he wanted everybody in the country to be subject to uniform rule from Moscow, where he was. Another was, he said, the British and French capitalists won't invest in Russia unless we seem to have codes of law. Now, Deng Xiaoping had both motives in mind, of course. So we have this very prominent legal effort with the leadership, the current leadership, emphasizing laws being very important. They're putting human rights in the Constitution, the protection of human rights, protection of property rights. All of this is good. The only question we have to ask is it all a sham? Is it all a bad joke perpetrated on the Chinese people? Does it, as Shakespeare said, keep the promise to the ear, but break it to the hope? Is it real? How real is it? That's why I put, I don't know if it's in the title you got, but you know, how political is the system as well as how legal? You can see it's quite legal, not only as a formal matter, but there are people in this room who can testify to the reality of what I'm saying. Their legal education has not been a sham. Some of them have participated in actual transactions in China or dispute resolution. Those things are real. They happened. They're not fictions that some propaganda agency has perpetrated on us. But in a meaningful sense, is this a legal system? And is it a just legal system? China is awash with the sense of injustice. And that sense of injustice is growing. You have what the Chinese would call a maodun, a contradiction, we would say a paradox. On the one hand, this has been the greatest 25 years, I think, for the people of China in their history, if you go beyond the immediate elite. And it's obvious, the people I see when I go back to China now are living so much better than the people I saw in the 70s in China. Not only living better economically, most people I'm talking about. Obviously, as I said at the outset, not everybody has benefited, and that's a problem. But most people are well off. Even a lot of these farmers who are protesting are better off. Even a lot of the people in the cities who are protesting, some of them going to jail, are better off. But we know from the history of other modernizing regimes that better off really doesn't stop people from protesting. It's the very success that leads to higher expectations that are not fulfilled in equivalent ways. And China now has one of the world's biggest gaps between rich and poor. And more people are poor than are rich, despite the success stories we're treated to in the press. So the question is, what can we say about legal institutions? Because the regime wants harmony. They want stability. And they often say to people, don't go into the streets. Don't protest. Don't interfere with government operations. Don't violate social order. Use legal institutions. Use the Xinfang petition system that give you a chance to put your case to government officials at every level. Well, that's what people have been doing, and what they have found is disillusionment. Now, not all people have been doing this. In most countries in the West, we trace the history of the development of law to the rising bourgeoisie, to the rising new commercial class of entrepreneurs who need law to secure their new gains, to structure their economy. In China, it isn't happening that way. And many human rights people are disappointed because they say economic development is supposed to lead to political development. It's supposed to lead to human rights protection. And that should come through the entrepreneurs. But the entrepreneurs are Chinese, and they operate in a very Chinese environment. And most of them don't use law so much. Occasionally they have to do it, but they don't rely on it. Give you just two quick examples. I have a friend who was a judge in China, a woman, very able, 20 years experience. Her husband was an entrepreneur. And one day he picked me up at the airport, and I had an hour to kill. I didn't know what to talk about during the trip, so I thought I'll ask him, what about law and business, his business? He said, yes, he has to make contracts. Do you use lawyers? I try not to, he said. The deals aren't so complex. They're only trade. They're not really investment deals. You have disputes? Sure. Do you use lawyers to help settle disputes? Oh, he said, I wouldn't use a lawyer. I said, what do you use? He said, my wife's a judge. She takes care of it through the guanxi system, through relations. So you're confronted by something that has the forms of Western law, adapted in principle to the Chinese environment, but the reality is this system is distorted. It's corroded by the non-uniform resort to it and application. The biggest problem is guanxi. It's relationships. Your classmate, your relative, your friend of friends, getting things done informally to beat the system. Corruption is a very serious problem, but I think guanxi's more serious. It's more widespread. But the line between guanxi and corruption is very hard at the fringe. Obviously, if money is passing and it's a direct bribe for a certain action, fine. But you know, foreigners also know how to build up guanxi. Does the head of the state enterprise I'm making a deal with have a daughter? A girlfriend? Somebody who wants a job abroad? Law firms have to watch out, as companies do, for the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. What can you do for these people? Well, you can give the management of the company you're negotiating with a trip to New York to talk to your management and visit Disneyland and maybe stop in Las Vegas and. The question is, where do you draw the line? So corruption and Guanxi are big problems. But there are other problems. Of course, professional competence is a big problem. But that's gradually being solved by progress in legal education that I mentioned. Local protectionism, however, is not being solved. Difang Baohu Zhui is a problem. The Qing dynasty had to deal with it, and the Qing dynasty dealt with it better than the current regime in China. In the Manchu dynasty, the last of China's imperial dynasties, to minimize the impact of local influence on the magistrate, they did not generally permit magistrates to go back and work in their home county. Had to go elsewhere, because otherwise the system would get them. And they wouldn't let them stay more than 3 years, because they figured after 3 years, you've built up a whole new network that you're subject to. And the whole corruption reciprocities that occur would again unduly corrode the system. Those would be good reforms today in China. Wouldn't be easy to achieve. And in their new 5-year plan, for the reform of the Chinese court system, the Supreme Court has recently made it clear it's got to pay more attention to the structural problems in the administration of justice. Local protectionism comes from the fact local courts are subject to the influence of the local government. That selects them, pays them, promotes them, fires them. They're not subject to central hiring. But now the regime is finally getting the point that maybe central hiring, if they can do it, it's a power question between the central government and the periphery. So we don't know how that will go. I think one test of the regime's seriousness about building up a legal system is, are they going to address this problem of who is a judge? What is a judge? How do you treat them? How do you pay them? How do you give them, to what extent do you give them judicial independence? This court document I mentioned, 5-year plan, at the same paragraph where they start out with the party's leadership. We got to follow the party's leadership. The party's got to control the courts, et cetera, et cetera. They say, of course, we're going to have judicial independence. So how do you reconcile those things? This has been a problem from the outset of the People's Republic. And if you look at the Kuomintang history, Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalist Party in the late 20s and 30s and 40s on the mainland, same problem. Chiang Kai-shek also believed in Lenin. He created a Leninist party. Came out of the same, you might say, lotus pond that Lenin created for the communists in China. There's a very nice article in the China Quarterly magazine of about 6-7 years ago. I think it's called Judicial Independence under the Kuomintang. And you could just take out Kuomintang and put in Gomchangdang, Chinese Communist Party, and it's all there. So this goes even beyond the nature of this particular system. One of the outstanding things accomplished in Taiwan today, in its continuing struggle to create a real legal system and curb corruption, is they have made their courts quite independent. And what I'm studying now is, how did they do it? What are the factors that brought that about while Taiwan is still awash in corruption in terms of anything legislative, even executive? But the courts and the prosecutor's office seem to have created a considerable culture of professionalism and independence. I may be exaggerating. I'm about to start some field work. I met with a Taiwan sociologist of law who's been here and going home tomorrow to try to enlist him. And the problem is, we don't know enough. We don't know enough how law operates in New York and Durham, not to mention how it operates in China and other foreign countries. And I would urge any of you, if you're looking for a useful life, try to combine law and social science, especially empirical social science. You know, sociology of law has two kinds. One that's concerned with theory. Max Weber said this, and, you know, etc. But I think theory has to emerge from practice. That's where Chairman Mao and the communist theory, I think, makes some sense. You have to have a unity of theory and practice. And we don't know enough about real practice relating to almost any aspect of law. So, on the one hand, we have all this legal construction, and we have committed people. See, we now have over 1 million people who could be called legal professionals in China. Certainly, if you take into account the police and the security police, the state police, you have the creation, even within the police, of people concerned about real law. I have friends from the top of municipal police forces to the research people and even young low-level people. We shouldn't underestimate. These people are not evil people. Everybody wants to do a professional job. Everyone wants to get up in the morning and think what I'm doing is not just interesting, it's important, but it has integrity. And so people want to believe in their own occupation. I noticed that 40 years ago when I interviewed public security officers who had left the mainland because they got in trouble in some way or other and were in Hong Kong. Nobody wants to feel his work is meaningless. But of course, there are many serious people in the prosecutor's offices, and lots in the courts, and lots in the Ministry of Justice, and other related ministries in China. And sometimes when they hear me go around and talk, they get depressed. I gave a talk in November at Yale Law School. I thought I was trying to be balanced and fair, but my first duty is to be realistic, to be honest within the extent I can be an observer of things or a participant observer. And afterwards, some of them who've been involved in legal aid in China, which is beginning to flourish, or involved in the Lawyers Association, or involved in the Ministry of Justice, they came up to me after and they said, "We feel very depressed." They didn't say what I said was wrong, but what I emphasized, they've been trying to keep out of their minds because they're contemplating a life, often a life in the law. And I like, whenever I say something difficult, and I say the same thing in China as I say here. I don't fudge, I don't trim. But I always use Deng Xiaoping's maxim, sure, cho, sure. Speak truth to facts. Let's look at the facts. Let's be honest. Because no real reform can come if you're just kidding yourself and you keep spouting theory or you keep just spouting law without asking, how is law implemented? So, you see where I'm heading. I'm heading into a situation where China is, where there is definitely rising rights consciousness. This is not the 60s or 70s or 80s. This is a place where lots of people believe in rule of law rhetoric, and the regime has been encouraging it. So this is pretty interesting, you see, but it's a crisis, because in the past, nobody was stupid enough to think I can go to court and sue the county government. Nobody encouraged that. But now, if you take seriously what's going on, lots of people are doing it. Even if lawyers in the countryside are afraid to do it, because their rice bowl depends on the county government. The last thing a local lawyer can afford to do is offend the local political elite. But the last thing a local judge can do is afford to offend the local political elite. So what's happening? Farmers who've never studied law begin to try to buy some law books, and there are some good ones in China. You can go into a bookstore now and not only find very legalistic texts and statutes and whatever, but you can find good how to do it books. You want to bring a lawsuit against an official? There's a wonderful book that lays it all out, step by step. And when the official says you must exhaust your local remedies before coming to court, You say, no, here's the provision of the administrative litigation law that says I can choose. And when the administrator then says, but the tax law, and this is tax law, says you must exhaust your remedies, then you say, if I'm a crippled person, the Sanjiren, I operate under the benefits of the national law for the protection of the crippled. And they say, I don't have to exhaust my remedies. I'm giving you an actual case. This happened in the Shandong countryside. A friend of mine and his brother, they're just farmers from a very poor village, 480 people. My friend is blind, so he got a chance, finally, after waiting till he was 13 to go to school, and even to a university-level school in Nanjing, where he learned Amwo, to be a massage specialist. But he took a course in law because he grew up with a very profound sense of discrimination against blind people and people who have other disabilities. And he started to use that interest when he got home. His mother-in-law, who was very unhappy her daughter married a blind man in the first place, and the daughter's a university graduate, said, why don't you earn an honest living and do Amwo like you learned? She's furious, but this guy he has a sense of injustice, and he has been trying to learn law on his own, and he's called a barefoot lawyer. 智角律师. It's a new phenomenon in the last 10 years in China. And these people are making some inroads, but it's an uphill fight, and they're more often disappointed than vindicated. Unfortunately, my friend, since August 11th, has lived in his farmhouse. He's not allowed to leave. He can't leave because the house is surrounded night and day since August 11th by anywhere from 30 to 200 local officials who won't let him out. They're furious because he blew the whistle on what local officials were doing. Beating up, locking up, occasionally killing families of women who were trying to escape forced abortion and forced sterilization. In some provinces in China, this is still very prominent. I was surprised. I thought we'd got through that period. And when I introduced him to the Washington Post, and they did a front page article on August 27th, and we got some local Beijing lawyers to go down to the countryside and do a report on all the abuses of the police. And my friend came up to Beijing in order to try to stir up more interest. The Shandong police came up and kidnapped him. I say kidnapped him because there was no shred of legal documentation. They just forcibly beat him up in the street, shoved him into a car, and took him back home. And since August 11th, when that happened, he hasn't been able to come out. Every time he tries to come out, he and his wife are beaten up. He travels with her because he's blind. Now, I wrote an article about this in the Far Eastern Economic Review in November, asking specifically the Minister of Public Security, who has made some good general reforms as Minister Zhou, to get a hold of these local people and stop this abuse. So far, it's had no impact, raising this whole question of how much does the center control the local people, for what purposes? Obviously, if it's the Falun Gong, the center goes all out. If it's spies from Taiwan, the center can control everything in the country, but you can only do that for a few things. Doesn't mean you can control everything about the stock market or the environmental protection law, protection of intellectual property, enforcement of court judgments. The fact is, the center is weak in China for most things, not all. The center is starved for tax money. The center has got its priorities wrong. The center better decide what kind of a legal system does it really want, because it's made things worse for itself, for stability, for harmony, for law, by exciting people's expectations and then dashing them. So that's why I think you could say China has a legal system. It's obviously a work in progress. It's obviously incomplete. It will never make real progress toward an effective legal system in foreign eyes until it has court reform, until it gives real judicial independence, until it allows the legal system a considerable degree of autonomy. Of course, we know from our own recent Supreme Court appointment fuss, which make absolutely clear that the old myth about law governs the Supreme Court alone, we see the extent to which political ideology is important. The relationship between politics and law and its peculiar manifestation in the United States. But of course, in China, it's much more vulgar. It's much less established. Then here, the leadership will have to face up to these questions or increasingly use force to suppress the rising, increasing disputes that are going on. So if I were sitting in the leadership chair in China, I'd be looking around and saying, maybe we have to give a little bit more than we've been giving to this legal system. Otherwise, maybe it's better to lower expectations, not to make people think they're living in a real rule of law country, because that can only make matters worse. So I think that's essentially my message. I may have left out a few points from my notes, but we have half an hour, and I'd love to hear from you. When I was a Harvard Law School professor, I noted my colleagues always said, I want to hear from you. But they often talk so long, they didn't give you an opportunity. And I noticed whenever one professor would talk, the others would all look at their watch. We like to hear ourselves, but I like to answer questions. So, as they say in Beijing, comrades, give me your criticisms. Please.
I'm just curious, from your observation.
Just speak up loud and clear, please.
Okay. From your observation of China's legal system, what's the key reason that you think that China's constitution cannot be implemented well, effectively?
Good. We haven't talked about that. That's a whole area I'm delighted to talk about. And also, the related question, the Communist Party is not immune to this rising rights consciousness. That's what's really interesting. After all, the Communist Party is not a legal agency. The Constitution in China has long enacted these fundamental rights, and you read the rights, even with the qualifications about according to law and under the party leadership. There are lots of rights in that Constitution, but until now, nobody's enforced them. There are many functions a Constitution can play. We Americans think a Constitution must be enforced, otherwise it's meaningless. And that means you've got to have judicial review, our peculiar contribution to history, giving due credit to the English for launching us on that path. And I think that's right, but it isn't the only function of a Constitution. The Constitution has the political campaign platform function that we have every 4 years during our presidential election. It articulates goals for society that nobody takes too seriously. It's kind of hot air. But it does give you the essence of what's important to the current leadership in the country. Constitution can have indirect influence on the growth of a legal system, but people inevitably want to enforce it. And in China, in the last 6 years, it's begun to be possible to enforce it. Now, of course, there are two possibilities, at least from an American point of view. One is the authorized communist system, which is not judicial review. The courts, as you know, are under the National People's Congress. Neither Mao nor Deng Xiaoping believed in Montesquieu, in the separation of powers. They have unified power, supposedly under the NPC and its standing committee, the National People's Congress. So the courts are under that, just like the executive branch and the prosecutors are under that. So many Chinese say, so how can you expect the courts to say an act of the National People's Congress, its boss, is unconstitutional? That's a problem even the UK, England, is beginning to address in terms of, is Parliament really absolute, or can a court at least ask Parliament, take another look? Is what you're doing consistent with the unwritten British Constitution? Well, China has a written constitution, so the compulsion to enforce it is very great. And there is a system. Supposedly, the Standing Committee of the NPC enforces the Constitution. The problem has been how to get there until the year 2000, when you had this Lifafa, the law and legislation, come out. It wasn't clear what the mechanism would be. But since then, a basic outline exists for people filing petitions and saying such and such a regulation, like re-education through labor, Laodongjiaoyang, or its antecedent, the shelter and repatriation, Shorong Qiansong, is unconstitutional. People are beginning to try that. People are beginning to use the authorized system. And the NPC Standing Committee is beginning to get geared up. They're still trying to fend off these things. They'd really, maybe like any good constitutional tribunal, rather avoid the problem, not reach the question. And so far, they've managed to do that. In the meantime, every day the courts of China are being asked by people, often by women who claim job discrimination of one kind or another, to say that the Constitution is being violated. And the court, in litigation between the women and the company that just fired them, should make that determination. And in 2001, it looked like that was going to happen. There was this famous case involving education, where the Supreme Court really seemed to give the green light to lower courts to start using the Constitution as a basis for decision making. Not to say the legislation of the National People's Congress, our superior, violates the Constitution, but to say in relation between you and me, private litigants, a state enterprise and its employees, we can take account of the principle that says women and men are equal. Well, after the Supreme Court made this momentous, undervalued announcement, nothing happened. Nothing happened. Somebody stopped that process cold. So, and I notice in this new call for another 5-year plan for the courts, they say we've got to improve our communication with the National People's Congress, and we have to improve our communication and the control of our interpretations. Very vague language, but it's on their agenda. It doesn't look like the courts for the foreseeable future are going to be enforcing the Constitution. That will put more pressure on the Standing Committee of the NPC. They have their own way, legislative institution for enforcing the Constitution, and I hope lawyers who've been very timid until very recently, that lawyers will try out the provisions of the law and legislation. Professor Ho-Wei Fang and a few younger law scholars have been trying that, and I hope there'll be more of it unless they're stopped. I want to say something about the party, but I don't want to forget to say something about lawyers. Lawyers need greater freedom. Law professors in China need greater freedom. Some law professors are lawyers, and some are activists. Some are told by the Judicial Bureau under the Ministry of Justice, in every city, they control lawyers, and they can stop you from handling cases. I discovered a few years ago, in 1999, provision of the Beijing Sifaju, the Judicial Bureau, that explicitly said to lawyers, you've got to get our approval for different kinds of cases. We even want to know how you're going to argue the case. And if you change your strategy, you better come back and tell us. And yet when you ask lawyers, even courageous criminal lawyers I know, I say, what about those regulations? They claim, I don't know anything about it. But every time a case comes up, this problem comes up. I'll give you 2 examples. In my barefoot lawyer blind man case, I mobilized one of his former lawyers. I said, you've got to go down to Shandong. He wants you to come down there and try to talk to the local authorities that are surrounding his house. He said, okay, I'll go tomorrow. There's a night train. The next morning, he called up the railroad station and booked a ticket. He was going to take the evening train. In the afternoon, the Beijing Judicial Bureau called him. 你没有汇报. You haven't reported to us. You haven't asked our permission. You can't go down there. We won't let you. Oh, very interesting. Can anyone say that the Judicial Bureau isn't controlling lawyers? It's not even a Falun Gong case. They clearly control every move, as I'll give you another story. A American business in Shenzhen found out its office manager was a Falun Gong activist. This was just last fall, I think, probably end of September, early October. This guy was not smart. He was conducting Falun Gong activity in the office in violation of company rules. And some of the employees didn't like it. So they turned him into the police, and the police came and took him away. Well, then the company got worried. What are its obligations to the office manager? They really wanted to fire him. On the other hand, they couldn't just ignore him in the arms of the police. So they called me, and I found a lawyer in Shenzhen who was a good criminal lawyer, and he said two things. I'm happy to take the case, he said, but first I must ask the approval of the Judicial Bureau. He couldn't take the case without the approval. Second, he said, I have to get the agreement of all my partners in my law firm. That's a rule imposed by the Judicial Bureau. There's nothing in the law that says that, but it's a way to make lawyers think again. Do they really want to risk their lawyer's license? Do they want to risk their law practice? And maybe the partners will say, no, we have a good law firm. We can't lose our law firm. We just had a lawyer in Beijing, Gao Zhisheng, who lost his lawyer's license, whose law firm is closed, etc. This is not unusual. I didn't want to forget to talk about that question, but finally, I'm sorry to give you such a long-winded answer, but you're giving me an excuse to make up a few points I forgot. I think one of the most interesting developments in China is the extent to which the party itself is being affected by due process, by fairness, by an ideology of we all have individual rights. And this comes up when the party has got to decide what to do about one of its wayward members. Should we oust him from the party? Kaichu. Fire him. Just as an example, that's the most severe sanction. It may give lesser sanction. Well, now under the party rules, for the first level of party members, not the highest level yet, they have to give him notice. What is the charge against the person? They have to give him a hearing. They have to tell him what the evidence is and let him challenge it. They have to let him produce witnesses. They have to let him have someone to help him defend himself if he feels the need of it. They have to give him a right to appeal. They're judicializing the Communist Party sanctioning processes that are not an official governmental function. And more people are also getting concerned about what they call shuangui. Shuangui is a symbol for if a party official, especially a high-level person, is under suspicion, the party disciplinary committee will not send him immediately to the criminal process, but will themselves take over the investigation. They have more confidence in their own investigation than in the police, even the security police that can be corrupted. So they have that. And only when the disciplinary commission feels it's ready to decide on the person's fate do they then say, okay, now we hand him over to the criminal justice system if we think he should also be prosecuted and convicted. And the party has developed a kind of a court, which they call the, let me see if I get the name right, Dangji Fating, the Party Discipline Tribunal. Like the subdivision of the People's Court is called a Renmin Fating, the People's Tribunal. This is a party disciplinary tribunal. And we need to know a lot more. How does it really work? And I'm working on that now. But I think it's a really interesting development because it shows these ideas are contagious. Nobody likes to live under arbitrary rule, and the Chinese people lived under arbitrary rule for a long time. You want to make a comeback on that? You want to respond to that? Maybe I haven't answered your question.
So like, if I summarize your response, so you think party prevailed law is one of the reasons, and another reason is the
Certainly the party has a higher priority. The party controls the legal system, ultimately. I'll give you an example. I've taught many students in the last 4 years who are prosecutors and judges in China in a special LLM program at Tsinghua University. And some of my prosecutor students have said, we know what criminal procedure provides. We're supposed to check on police violations. Is somebody being held overtime? Is there evidence to justify a prosecution or even an arrest warrant? But the political reality is we can't do it. It's just not, in the local political circumstances, we're not strong enough. In some systems, like Taiwan, the prosecutor dominates the system. The prosecutor even dominates the court, and certainly the police. Maybe in South Korea you could say the same thing. But not in the mainland. In the mainland, the police dominate the system, and the prosecutors and judges have to operate within that reality. It's interesting. Yes, please.
Sorry.
Go ahead. What is your view on the effect of international law in China? Because you
Great.
seem to be thinking that law in action is different from law on the books when it comes to domestic law, but is international law taken more seriously or less seriously?
China, I never finished the point I started before. I said there were four waves that have impelled legal reform. I did talk about the Cultural Revolution's impact, but I never got beyond that. The second wave was foreign investment. The desire to attract direct foreign investment has been a huge stimulus to the creation of a legal, civil, and administrative system. Has less to do with criminal justice, but some. The third wave was 1992 and after the desire to create capital markets, have stock markets, attract the investment banks. And that was a big stimulus to financial law and its related administrative underpinnings. The third wave started in the late 90s with the need to get in the WTO. And that has had a big impact on administrative justice in China because transparency is one of the demands of the WTO. You got to make your legal system available. And if they won't tell you what the law provides, they say it's a Neibu Wenjian internal document. That won't wash anymore. It's not effective. And if an official engages in arbitrary conduct, they have to have an impartial agency to review the legality of that conduct. So this has been a big spur, but not to criminal law, pretty much, criminal procedure. Now, the big spur to criminal procedure, and China has been working on this for a long time, but not yet reached a conclusion, is will China ratify the UN Convention on political and civil rights, which in effect enacts an international criminal procedure code. And they've been working on this for a long time. Many scholars, and in China, legal scholars play a very important role. Occasionally in America, we have law professors who are law reformers and have some influence, but in China, they're much more. And Professor Chen Guangzhong at Zhengfa Dashra, Chinese University of Political Science and Law, and Chen Weidong at Renmin University, and various others have been laboring mightily to have new laws of criminal procedure, etc., that will match the UN Convention. The problem is China signed this convention about 1997, maybe 98. Well, it's getting embarrassing. Of course, the U.S. has occasionally signed things and then even repudiated them. So we have to, again, keep that in mind. But internally in China, this is very controversial, because this would be a profound effect on the legal system, similar to WTO on the administrative law system. This would have a profound effect on the criminal justice system. And there's a lot of debate. And certainly they can't ratify this commitment if they don't do away with administrative punishment. They have something called Lao Dong Jiao Yang, which means the police themselves can give you 3 or 4 years in a confinement. That looks very much like reform through labor, the criminal sanction. But the criminal sanction means you got to first get the approval of a prosecutor and a court. But police can still put you away for 3 or 4 years. This can't possibly be consistent with adherence to the covenant, UN covenant. So China's in the midst of ferment now. The adherence to international standards. One of the best things I could say in the 1980s, if I wanted China to adopt some legal reform, general or specific, I'd say this is good for foreign investment. If you do this, it will encourage foreign investment. If you said this is good for human rights, forget it. But you say good for, so there are certain mantra you could invoke. And if China ratifies this convention, even with some caveats, some qualifications, etc., reservations, it will be a big boost. But I don't see it happening at this point. They're stuck on what to do about whether to get rid of re-education through labor and the police power to send you away on their own. Please.
This is a kind of broad question. But
Speak up so they can hear you.
This is a broad question, but do you see a greater interplay between China and Hong Kong's legal system in the future?
Well, there has been an interplay of significance since 1978. Until then, Hong Kong people just had no interest in the mainland, including Hong Kong lawyers. They were all so UK-oriented. And they thought people like me were very strange foreigners, these vulgar Americans. But beginning 78, 79, all of a sudden, lawyers, British and Chinese in Hong Kong, began to take China seriously because they saw there was money to be made. And they saw 1997 would have to come. It would be some kind of an amalgamation. China, right from 1979, began to learn, especially the Shenzhen Special Economic Zone and the Shakou area within it, began to develop contract law, began to develop company law, and they were very influenced by the contacts with lawyers who were giving them a British company law that didn't seem quite suitable to most people in China. But they've always had that influence. Hong Kong influence is very significant, but it's still limited. As you know, there are a lot of areas in China where Hong Kong people aren't considered very reliable partners, or they're not liked socially. Or you have a lot of regional biases, etc. And there's a lot of mutual mistrust. But Hong Kong's influence is likely to be greater as Hong Kong gets more integrated with the mainland. Question, comment? We got 5 minutes. Yes.
Two questions. The first question is, do you believe Chinese central government will take advantage of the Chinese legal institutions to, forward our legal movement to, gain more power for the central governments and restrict the local provincial government's powers, and by using our, legal reforms? This situation is a little bit like the England situation. Like the kings just gradually lose their power, so the kings just assign the judges into the local governments to establish the king's power.
I feel sure the Chinese central government would like to have greater power over the provinces and big cities and localities, and it would make their international behavior less subject to criticism. if they could really control what the customs people are doing down there and whether they're exporting prison-made goods, and just endless questions. But it's very hard to do, and they might find it, even if they make a greater effort, politically too disruptive. You have powerful local interests who are able to exert their power even in the Politburo. So it's a real question. And they have to choose very carefully, when do they interfere and when don't they interfere? And only on the highest priority questions will they expend the political capital and the human and economic resources to try to get control. But I think a litmus test is, are they going to gain control of the appointment and removal and promotion and payment of judges? See, in Japan, you have judicial independence, but Japan has its own special environment. Anybody here from Japan who knows? Good. Well, they have judicial independence, but they have a central secretariat for selecting, promoting, moving justices around, and they pick from quite a coherent group, and they give them a good professional, practical, additional legal training. They take all the steps necessary to make sure, although the judges have judicial independence in principle, they're unlikely to be too troublesome. And a judge knows, if today he's in the Tokyo District Court and he makes a decision on a constitutional or otherwise controversial question that the dominant group under the dominant political party that's been in power for almost the entire post-war period, tomorrow he may be told that he's assigned to Kyushu instead of staying in Tokyo, because the central administration has the power to move people around. And people don't like to be out in the boondocks, especially it means separation from their families, etc. So I think China would like to have that system where they have central control. Now, what should we advocate? In principle, I like federalism. I like restraints on power. I don't like to see an all-power authoritarian government in China. But I don't like to see local protectionism either. I don't like to see all the abuses I described earlier that take place in the localities in China. So I find myself coming out, at least temporarily and tentatively, on the side of structural reform that would give the more responsible people in the Supreme Court and the Ministry of Justice greater control. In principle, I admire very much a lot of the law reforms the Supreme Court has made, general principles. In practice, I criticize very strongly some of their own decisions. They are not a very good model on administrative, civil, or criminal matters for the rest of the country. The way they handle individual cases, and they don't like my criticism, but it's true. They should be a model, not only in general principles, but in concrete cases. And maybe that will get better. As I said, I'm an optimist. Yes?
Last question, maybe. So as a young Chinese generation, especially we students studying here, learning a lot of common law things, and what's our responsibility, or I would say, what can we do if we go back to China? Could you give us some suggestions?
You are the lifeblood of the new generation, and although some people may reject you or suspect you because you've been infected by this American or Anglo-American or European influence, you can overcome that. And you have examples. Gao Xiqing, one of Duke's illustrious JD alumni. He played a major role, has played, and will play a major role. So I encourage you to go back. Then the question is, when you go back, what to do? How to play the game. I went through this with a generation of graduate students at Harvard from Taiwan or South Korea. Liu Sholian, the notorious Annette Liu, who was vice president, we talked for a long time in June of 1978. Should she go back to Taiwan or stay in America and work on the Taiwan independence movement from America? And she decided, I think rightfully, to go back. But we knew if she's going to do political activity there, she ran a very high risk of going to jail. And she did, 5 years. Sentenced to 12. And the only thing that got her out was I got Ma Ying-jeou to help her, oddly enough, because they don't like each other. They have very different political views. But he was a very good, he realized it was good for the Kuomintang. After the Jiangnan Ming'an, the assassination of Henry Liu in San Francisco, everybody thought the Kuomintang smelled especially bad. And they had to rehabilitate themselves. And the first thing I said they should do is release Liu Shoulian from prison. So she could have gone back and been a corporate lawyer or just written about women's liberation. That would have been quite safe. But she wanted to do what she felt was her destiny. And look what happened. Ultimately, she came out of it, benefiting from the jail experience, certainly politically. Or I think about a very sad case from South Korea. In 1970 to 72, there was a Harvard Yenching fellow named Che, who was a young professor at Seoul National University. Che Chong-gil, I think. I don't know. Any Koreans in the room here? Yeah, so you could pronounce it better.
That's correct.
Professor Che was a very sweet professor of conflict of laws, a legal professional. His English wasn't so good. German was his field. He got a PhD in Cologne. But he had the chance to come to Harvard. I used to talk to him occasionally. Very nice person. Well, he went back to General Park's regime after the dictatorship had been declared, 73. So he went back in 72. Like many other institutions, including Harvard, if a professor goes abroad and has a good time, often he comes home and they give him a very bad job. I had a wonderful year in Japan in 71, 72. When I went back to Harvard, they punished me by putting me as chairman of the Committee to Reform First-Year Grading. If you don't think that was punishment, that was very controversial. Well, poor Professor Che, after 2 years at Harvard, he went to Seoul National University again, and they made him Dean of Student Affairs. To be Dean of Student Affairs in 1972-73 at Seoul National University was a terrible job. Because in those days, General Park passed a regulation that said students who cut class without plausible excuse were subject to the death penalty. That's a good way to improve class attendance. But it creates a problem. It creates a problem for the professors. Because if the Seoul National Law students are going to come to class again, instead of rioting in the streets, you have to have something to say to them. But you weren't allowed to say anything. You couldn't discuss constitutional law. Conflict of laws you could, but not constitutional law or administrative law. Those were great days in Seoul. I took part in those events. But poor Professor Che, in October 73, they discovered his body at the base of the KCIA, Korean CIA headquarters, dead. They claimed he jumped out of a bathroom window that had bars on it. Impossible. What apparently happened was under torture, they had picked him up and said he was a North Korean spy who had been infected in Germany years earlier. They had no evidence on him, so they tortured him. And he had a heart condition and he died. Then they just dropped him outside like a carcass of meat. His wife was a medical doctor. Lots of signs of beating and torture. And that was it. So you see the problems of people who go abroad to study. And this poor guy, there was no evidence ever that he was part of a North Korean spy ring, but he was suspected and they were determined. His son is a law professor who came to visit me last Saturday and has been working, in addition to getting his PhD at Cologne from the same professor, Gerhard Kegel, that his father took his degree from. The son has been working on transitional justice and put out a book including his father's case. So the problems of being a foreign graduate student in one country that's very different from your country. I wrote a full-page article about this in the Asian Wall Street Journal in December '79 after Liu Sholian was convicted and sentenced to 12 years imprisonment. I had no influence at that time with the Taiwan government. They hated me because I had helped normalize relations between the US and China, which was a profound shock to Taiwan. So all I could do was operate from outside Taiwan, and I wrote this long article appealing to their own sense of not only humanity, but self-interest, to release her and the 7 other people who were convicted with her, all with long sentences. But it didn't cut any ice, as they say. So I talked in that article about the problems of the foreign graduate student. You come to a place like Duke and you get reinforced your own interest in democratic values and legal procedures and human rights, and then you have to confront the future. Do you abandon your country? Do you work actively from another country to improve things? Do you go back and keep your nose clean and become a corporate lawyer? Do you go back and become a political activist? These aren't simple questions. Well, I always liked the title of Lenin's famous book, translated into Chinese, "Zamaban." What should be done? That's what we're all here to talk about. Thanks.
Yeah. They're a little late.
Last Sunday, but because the board member part of the board members wait, so they don't have enough members to do it.
That's why they had a week late.
Yeah.